Welcome. From the United States to the United Kingdom, from Canada to Germany, from the Netherlands to Australia, and to every corner of our beautiful world. If you haven't already, please subscribe. We're growing every single day, and we want you to be part of this journey. Comment below where you're watching from. We're so grateful to know how far this story has reached. Now, sit back, relax, turn off the world for a moment. This is the story of a blind Omega deemed worthless by a kingdom built on hierarchy, who taught an entire realm that real power has nothing to do with sight and everything to do with refusing to accept the world's definition of your worth. Let us begin. In the kingdom of Silver Spire, there lived a man who commanded 10,000 warriors. A man whose name alone made enemies tremble. A man whose wolf could tear through stone and whose authority was absolute, unchallenged, eternal. His name was Dante, and he was Alpha King of everything he surveyed. But tonight, none of that mattered. Because in a chamber high in the castle lit by dying candlelight and the fever glow of ancient curse magic, that man was on his knees, literally on his knees beside a bed where his 8-year-old son lay gasping for breath, his small body convulsing as black veins of pure, corrupted magic spread across his chest like living shadows. Those black veins moved, they writhed, they pulsed with a malevolent intelligence that no healer in the entire realm had been able to break. 63 healers. 63 failures. The most powerful shamans in the Northern Territories? Tried. Ancient mages from the High Council? Failed. A legendary healer who hadn't left her tower in 300 years? She'd taken one look at the curse mark and actually wept, not out of compassion but out of recognition. Because whoever placed this curse didn't just want to hurt this child, they wanted to break the king, and they knew exactly how to do it. You see, this curse wasn't made with anger, it was made with something far more dangerous. It was made with intimacy, with knowledge, with the kind of desperate love that turns into desperate destruction when that love isn't returned. And as Dante sat there, watching his son's breathing become more shallow, more erratic, more final, he realized something that shattered him more completely than any battlefield ever could. His power meant absolutely nothing. His crown was useless. His strength was impotent. His entire life had been built on the assumption that dominance, hierarchy, control, that these things would protect the people he loved. And he was wrong. Ronan was dying, and there was nothing the great Alpha King could do to stop it. That's when the last healer, an old woman named Mira with eyes that had seen centuries of suffering, stood up from the boy's bedside and said something that would change everything. "My king, I cannot break what I cannot understand, but whoever cursed your son, they knew your family intimately. This curse is woven with love and betrayal, the most dangerous kind of magic, the kind that can only be unmade by someone who understands both emotions completely." And in that moment, Dante's face went absolutely still, because he knew. Deep in his bones, in the animal part of his wolf that never lied to him, he knew exactly who that person was. The girl he'd rejected 15 years ago, the blind Omega he'd deemed unworthy, the one he'd chosen the throne over. The one who'd never stopped haunting him, not because of what she represented, but because of what she'd shown him was possible, a future where power didn't matter, where hierarchy was a lie, where love was the only truth that actually meant something. Nova. But there was a problem. A massive, impossible problem. Because Dante had spent the last 15 years pretending she didn't exist. He'd built a life, a kingdom, an entire empire on the foundation of that rejection. He'd told himself it was necessary, that he'd made the right choice. That strength meant not looking back, not questioning, not feeling. Now his son was dying, and the only person in the entire world who might be able to save him was the one woman he'd destroyed. The one woman who had every right to let him suffer. The one woman who, if she was even alive, if she was even still remotely interested in helping him, could demand absolutely anything in return. Dante stood up slowly, his hands shaking for the first time in decades. He walked to the window and looked out over his vast, powerful, beautiful kingdom. And then he did something he hadn't done since he was a young man, full of hope and belief in something beyond hierarchy. He asked himself a question that terrified him more than death itself. What if she refused him? What if he'd hurt her so badly that she wouldn't even come? What if he had to watch his son die knowing the cure was out there, but the person holding it was someone he'd broken beyond repair? Because here's what Dante didn't understand yet. Sometimes, the most powerful moment of a man's life isn't when he wins a war. It's not when he builds an empire or commands thousands. Sometimes, the most powerful moment is when he finally admits that he was wrong about everything that mattered, and he's willing to lose it all just for a chance to be better. The question was, would she let him? Chapter 1. The Dying Prince. The castle had seen 63 of them come through those heavy oak doors. 63 healers, each one more renowned than the last, each one promised wealth beyond measure if they could break what no one else could. But desperation has a way of making you sloppy. It makes you sound like a man begging rather than a man commanding. And Dante had learned long ago that people don't respect desperation, they exploit it. The first healer was young, confident, surrounded by crystals and sacred oils that filled Ronan's chamber with the scent of lavender and something else. Something that made the boy's breathing worse. Dante watched from the doorway as the man chanted in languages that didn't exist anymore, his hands moving in precise patterns, sweat pooling at his temples. Within an hour, the curse marks had spread further. Within 2, the healer was stumbling backward, his power completely exhausted, his face pale with the realization that he'd made things worse. "I cannot break this curse," he'd whispered. The second healer was different, ancient, a shaman who'd been alive when most of the world was still wild and untamed. She took one look at the curse marks spreading across Ronan's small chest, and something shifted in her weathered face. A recognition, a fear. "It's ancient," she'd said, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "Older than my magic. Older than the magic that should be mine to wield." By the third, Dante had stopped asking questions. He'd stopped hoping. He'd simply stood there, in a darkened chamber watching his son die, 1 inch at a time. This last one, Healer Mira, she was different though. She didn't pretend. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She just sat beside Ronan's bed, ran her weathered fingers along the curse marks, and then looked up at Dante with eyes that had seen too much suffering to lie. "Whoever placed this curse knew your family intimately," she'd said quietly. "This isn't the work of an enemy, my king. This is the work of someone who loved you. Someone who was willing to damn their own soul to make you understand what you've done." The words had hit like a physical blow, because in that moment, standing in that chamber with his son dying and a healer telling him the truth he'd been running from for 15 years, Dante knew. He knew exactly who had done this, and it terrified him more than death itself. The war room was cold stone and older maps, the kind that showed kingdoms that didn't exist anymore. General Thorne sat across from him, his shoulders heavy with the weight of delivering impossible news to a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. "There's a girl," Thorne had said carefully, "out in the exiled settlement. 3 days north, she's said to be gifted." Dante had felt his entire body go rigid. A girl. Blind since birth. Omega. But the rumors. A blind Omega? The words came out like acid. Like reflex. Like the same words his father had spoken to him all those years ago. What could a blind Omega possibly do that 63 of the most powerful healers in our realm couldn't? He'd regretted it immediately. Not because he believed it, but because he'd said it out loud, and saying it meant admitting that his first instinct was still the same one that had shaped his entire life. That weakness came in packages. That blindness meant incapacity. That hierarchy was real. But Thorne just watched him with those knowing eyes and said, "The people in that settlement say she heals things others can't touch. That she sees in ways that don't require eyes. See in ways that don't require eyes." That's when Dante had felt it, that pull in his chest, that ancient recognition his wolf had never quite forgotten, because his wolf had always known. It had been screaming at him for 15 years, even when his mind refused to listen. The memory came to him unbidden, the way memories do when you're drowning. He was back in a garden that no longer existed, or maybe it did, but he'd simply never allowed himself to return to it. Young, reckless, believing that love could matter more than power. Nova had been sitting on a stone bench, her fingers trailing over the carvings in the rock like she could read a story there that no one else could see. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with sight in the way she moved. the way her whole body seemed to listen to the world around her. "Tell me what you see," she'd asked him, and he'd taken her hand. "I see my future," he'd answered. "I see someone who understands me without needing to look at my face to know me." He'd kissed her then, and it had felt like coming home. Like the entire universe had finally made sense. 3 days later, his father had summoned him. "The throne or the girl," his father had said, and Dante had felt something inside him shatter like glass. Choose. He'd chosen. He always chose wrong. When he'd gone back to the garden to tell her, Nova hadn't cried. That was the thing that haunted him most. She hadn't broken. She'd just gone absolutely still. The way prey goes still when they realize the predator is no longer hunting them because they've already decided you weren't worth the effort. "I can't see you anymore," he'd said, because cruelty had always been easier than honesty. "You're not suitable for a king. I need strength, not mercy." She'd turned away, and he'd let her go. He'd stood there in that garden as the sun set and watched the woman his wolf had already claimed slip out of his life, and he'd done absolutely nothing to stop it. Now, 15 years later, standing alone in his private chambers with the sound of his son's labored breathing echoing from across the castle, Dante made a choice. He removed his crown, placed it carefully on the marble table beside his bed. "If I'm to beg her," he'd whispered to the darkness, "I'll do it as a man, not a king, because a king could command obedience. But a man who'd spent 15 years running from the only truth that ever mattered? A man who'd spent 15 years proving to himself that hierarchy was worth more than love? That man would have to offer everything, and he had no idea if everything would be enough. The shift came hard and fast, his bones cracking and reforming, his body exploding into the massive primal form that was his true self. Dante's wolf erupted from beneath the skin, muscles rippling, fur dark as midnight spreading across his massive frame. His eyes glowed amber in the shadows of his chamber, ancient and powerful and desperate. This was what he truly was. Not a man in a throne, but an animal driven by instinct, and his instinct screamed mate. General Thorne waited at the castle gates with provisions, watching silently as the Alpha King's wolf form emerged from the darkness. No saddle, no pretense, just raw, primal power that needed no trappings of civilization. "The exiled settlement," Thorne had said simply, and Dante's wolf had answered with a low growl that vibrated through the earth itself. The journey north was a blur of speed and desperation. Dante's wolf form covered ground no human could traverse 3 days compressed into something closer to 18 hours as he ran through forests and across mountains, his paws barely touching the earth. But it wasn't the physical journey that was consuming him. It was the way his animal consciousness raged against his human mind, the way his wolf knew where she was, could almost scent her on the wind. Mate, mate, mate. His wolf didn't care about hierarchy, didn't care about kingdoms or thrones or the 15 years of silence. His wolf only knew that the other half of his soul was out there, somewhere in the north, and every second that passed was a second too long. The transformation had fractured something in him. In his human form, Dante could rationalize, could build walls, could construct narratives about why she didn't matter. But in his wolf form? In his wolf form, there was no lying. There was only hunger and recognition and the terrifying knowledge that he'd thrown away the only thing in his entire existence that had ever been real. By the time the exiled settlement appeared on the horizon, Dante's wolf was barely contained. His form rippled with barely suppressed power, his breathing ragged, his entire being vibrating with need and fear, and the desperate hope that she might give him a chance to fix what he'd broken. He shifted back to human form at the gates, forcing himself back into his skin, back into the limitations of being a man, rather than surrendering completely to the animal. But it took everything he had, every ounce of control, because his wolf wanted to run through those gates howling her name. His wolf wanted to find her and claim what should have always been his. But Dante the man, the king, the one who'd rejected her, he had to walk forward on human legs. He had to choose to be vulnerable. The settlement itself was nothing like he'd imagined. It wasn't a prison of forgotten people. It was alive. Warm candlelight spilled from windows. Gardens overflowed with healing herbs and flowers that shouldn't have been growing in this season. People moved through the streets with purpose and dignity omegas. Mostly, but also the blind, the disabled, the ones the kingdom had deemed unsuitable, the ones like her. And somewhere in those shadows, in one of those warm, glowing buildings, was the woman his wolf recognized before his mind ever could. The woman whose blindness had taught her to see clearer than anyone he'd ever known. The woman who was about to decide whether the man who'd rejected her was worthy of redemption. Dante stepped forward, his bare feet hitting the earth of a place he had no right to enter. He'd conquered battlefields. He'd built empires. He'd bent hierarchies to his will through sheer force of dominance. But standing at the gates of the exiled settlement, the scent of her magic reaching him now intoxicating, familiar, home, Dante finally understood what true powerlessness felt like. And he walked toward it anyway. Chapter 2. Strength in Darkness. The exiled settlement breathed differently than the kingdom. It didn't gasp for air like a creature suffocating under hierarchy. It lived. Deeply. Authentically. In a way that made the castle feel like a beautiful tomb. Nova moved through the gardens at dusk, her fingers trailing across plants that whispered their secrets to her in the language of leaves and stems and the particular hum that each herb sang. Chamomile spoke of calm, moonflower of renewal, bloodroot of the difficult healings, the ones that required you to bleed before you could mend. She didn't need eyes to know which plant was which. She'd memorized this sanctuary the way most people memorize their own heartbeat, not through conscious effort, but through the simple act of living inside something long enough for it to become part of your nervous system. The worn wooden railings beneath her fingers were old friends, scarred by weather and time and the hands of dozens of Omegas who'd gripped them while learning that they had worth beyond what the kingdom had told them. Each groove in the wood was a story. Each smooth patch was a person who'd stood exactly where Nova stood now, and realized for the first time that powerlessness and strength weren't opposites. "Alyssa," Nova called out before the young Omega had even fully entered the healing garden. She didn't hear her, not with her ears anyway. She felt her, the inflammation radiating from an infected wound on the girl's shoulder, the way pain made a person's energy flicker like a candle in the dark. Alyssa froze. "How did you—" "Sit." Nova's hands were already glowing. That soft, silver-white luminescence that came from somewhere deeper than magic, somewhere that lived in the marrow of her bones where understanding crystallized into healing. "You didn't clean it properly. Infection is always messier than wounds. It spreads through systems, makes you think the damage is bigger than it actually is." She wasn't just talking about the infected shoulder. Alyssa sat, and Nova's hands found the wound with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. The touch was gentle, but certain. Nova's fingers traced the edges of the infection, feeling how the bad magic had burrowed in, how it had convinced the body's own defenses to work against themselves. "This is what they do," Nova murmured, more to herself than to Alyssa. "The hierarchy. The lies they tell us they work like infection. They get inside your system, convince you that the damage is permanent, make you believe that you're fundamentally broken." The girl gasped as the infection began to dissolve beneath Nova's hands. The blackness receded like shadows before dawn. The inflammation faded. The wound didn't disappear. Scars are honest things, and Nova never pretended otherwise, but it stopped destroying. "Why does your power work like this?" Alyssa whispered, watching the glow fade from Nova's palms. "When everyone else just blasts curses away with force?" Nova sat back, her sightless eyes somehow still managing to see the girl with complete clarity. "Because I learned to heal from the inside out. I learned that power isn't about dominance. It's about understanding. When you understand what broke something, you understand how to fix it." She stood, moving with a grace that came from 15 years of moving through the same space, until every corner was as familiar as her own body. The sanctuary was hers not because she owned it, but because she'd learned to inhabit it completely. The sun hung low over the valley that evening, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. Nova sat in her private garden, a small space behind the main building, where healing herbs grew in organized chaos, and a stone bench waited for moments like this, when a woman needed to hold her own pieces together before they scattered across the floor. She touched the pendant at her throat, a wolf carved from stone, so old now that the edges had smoothed, the details worn away by 15 years of her fingers finding it again and again. A habit, a wound, a reminder of everything she'd chosen to survive rather than destroy. Blindness is a language the world doesn't speak, she'd told herself 10,000 times, and each repetition was both truth and lie. So I learned to translate. But translation only went so far. There were limits to what metaphor could hold. The locked box on the shelf inside her chamber held things she couldn't afford to look at. Letters Dante had never written. Futures she'd imagined and then carefully unmade, piece by piece. Love letters she'd composed in her own head and never sent, because sending them would have meant admitting that even after 15 years, some small part of her still believed in redemption. Her own redemption or his? She couldn't decide which terrified her more. You can feel him, can't you? Alara's voice came from the shadows, and Nova didn't even flinch. Her second-in-command had learned long ago that stealth meant nothing to someone who'd learned to perceive the world through absence and presence rather than through sight. Yes. There was no point in lying. Not to Alara. And you're afraid. It wasn't a question. Nova didn't answer it like one. I'm afraid of what I might forgive him for. I'm afraid of what I might ask him to suffer in return. But mostly... She paused, her hand stilling on the stone wolf. Mostly I'm afraid that when I feel him, when I'm in the same space as him, when I can sense his heartbeat and the way his wolf recognizes me, I'll remember exactly why I loved him, and all the walls I've spent 15 years building will crumble like sand. Alara sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching. Would that be so terrible? For him? Nova's laugh was bitter and complicated. No. For me? Yes. I've spent 15 years making myself whole without him. Making myself more than whole. I've built a sanctuary. I've healed people. I've created something that matters. If I let him back in, I have to trust that he's actually changed. And trust. She trailed off, her fingers finding the pendant again. Trust is harder than anger. Anger kept me sharp. Anger kept me moving. Trust requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is the one thing I'm not sure I can afford anymore. The night deepened around them. Somewhere in the settlement, children slept. The gardens settled into their evening rhythms. And at the edge of Nova's awareness, something approached like a storm gathering on the horizon. She felt him before dawn broke. Not with her eyes. Never with her eyes. But with something older and more primal. The way animals feel earthquakes before they shake the ground. The way prey feels the approach of something ancient and powerful and claiming. Nova stood at the edge of the settlement, facing north, and every nerve in her body sang. A king's scent was unmistakable. It was power and dominance, and the particular musk of someone accustomed to being obeyed. But underneath that was something else, something that made her wolf want to howl in recognition, something that whispered mate in a language older than words. She'd felt him approaching for 3 days now, this distant vibration on the edges of her perception. Growing closer, growing more desperate. His wolf's desperation was pouring off him in waves, the way heat radiates from a forest fire. And she'd had to make a choice. Would she hide? Would she pretend not to know? Would she do what a smart woman would do and bar her doors, refuse him entry, send him back to whatever kingdom he'd crawled out of? Or would she finally make him see what she'd become? Nova closed her sightless eyes and took a breath that seemed to travel through her entire body. She could taste him now on the wind, could feel the exact moment his wolf form crossed the final ridge, the moment he caught her scent and howled a sound of recognition and desperation and the kind of hunger that couldn't be sated by mere survival. This was an alpha wolf's claiming cry. This was Dante's wolf demanding what it had recognized as its own. And Nova had to decide if she was willing to let him have it. The question was never whether he'd find me. She whispered to the darkness. The question is whether I'm strong enough to make him understand that finding me doesn't mean he gets to keep me. She felt him shift back to human form at the gates. Felt him strip away the wolf and step into the vulnerability of skin and bare feet and the profound powerlessness of a man who'd just realized he'd traveled 3 days only to discover that redemption wasn't a thing you could demand. It was a thing you had to earn, and she wasn't sure she believed he was capable of the work. The council met in a circle that evening, as they did every evening. No one sat above anyone else. Nova refused hierarchy even in its smallest manifestations. They gathered to discuss the month's herb gathering, the distribution of healing responsibilities, the two omegas from the neighboring pack who wanted to join their community. Nova listened to everyone. She didn't interrupt. She didn't command. She simply held space for each voice, letting them resonate and settle before the next one began. This was what leadership looked like in the sanctuary. Not dominance, but the ability to make everyone in the room feel like their contribution mattered. "Should we accept them?" asked Mira, one of the oldest healers in the settlement. "The two from the north? We're stable now, but adding more mouths." "We have enough," Nova said simply. "The question isn't whether we can feed them, it's whether they need what we're offering." "And if they do?" asked another voice, younger, uncertain. "Then we offer it," Nova said. "That's the whole point, isn't it? This place exists because there are omegas who looked in the mirror and saw what the kingdom told them to see nothing. We exist to show them that the kingdom was lying." The children's lessons happened in the common room the next afternoon. Nova sat in the center of a small circle of young faces, ages 5 to 12, all of them bearing that particular hunger in their eyes that came from having been told they were worthless and not quite believing it yet. "What does it mean to be an omega?" asked one small boy, maybe 6 years old, his voice barely a whisper. Nova didn't answer quickly. She let the question settle. Let it breathe. "They tell us we're weak because we feel deeply," she said finally. "But depth of feeling is power they can't access. Alphas know how to dominate. Betas know how to balance. But omegas? Omegas know how to understand. We see into the heart of things. We perceive pain and joy and nuance. And that's not weakness. That's the most sophisticated power there is." A girl, maybe 10, raised her hand. "But they hurt us because we feel." "Yes," Nova said, and she didn't soften it. "They hurt us because they're afraid of what happens when power starts feeling instead of just dominating. They're afraid that if you start caring about the people you control, you can't control them anymore. And they're right to be afraid, because compassion is the real revolution." She could feel Alara watching her from the doorway, could feel the weight of what was coming. Dante was at the gates. He was waiting, and Nova had to decide if she was going to let him through. Mara found her that night, the way old omegas always seemed to find Nova when something needed to be said. Mara was 63, with silver hair and eyes that had seen the worst of what hierarchy could do. She'd been cast out of her original pack at 45 for the sin of aging past her breeding years. Her own family had turned her away. She'd stood at the edge of a cliff once, ready to fall, when Alara had found her wandering and brought her to the sanctuary. "I was ready to end my life when I came here," Mara said without preamble, settling beside Nova on the bench where so many difficult conversations happened. "You gave me a reason to live. More than that, you gave me a reason to matter. You showed me that the pack was lying, that I had value that had nothing to do with whether I could bear children." Nova took Mara's hand, and they sat in silence for a long time. This was how healing worked sometimes, not through words or magic or grand gestures, but through the simple act of witness, through someone saying without preamble or performance, "I see you. I know what you've survived. And you still matter. He's here," Mara said eventually. "The king. At the gates." "I know," Nova replied. "Are you going to see him?" Nova didn't answer immediately. She was too busy holding the edges of herself together, too busy remembering how to breathe when the man who'd shattered her 15 years ago was finally close enough to touch. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow, I'll know if everything I've built is strong enough to withstand what he might ask of me." That night, Nova stood at the edge of the settlement again, facing the direction where Dante waited. She could feel his wolf pacing behind human skin, desperate and hungry and claiming, could feel the way his animal nature raged against civilization, against propriety, against the 15 years of separation that shouldn't have meant anything but somehow meant everything. Her own wolf answered him with a sound that wasn't quite a howl, more like a recognition, like saying, "I'm here. I've always been here. The question is whether you're strong enough to see me." Somewhere in the darkness, separated by walls and time and the entire history of their broken love, Dante's wolf howled in response, and Nova closed her sightless eyes and prepared for the moment that would change everything. The next morning, Nova stands at her door. Outside, footsteps approach. The confrontation is finally here. And nothing will ever be the same. Chapter 3. The Beggar King. The knock came at dusk, when the sanctuary had settled into its evening rhythms and the healing gardens had exhaled their final prayers into the fading light. Nova's hands stilled on the mortar she'd been grinding crushed moonflower petals for the night remedies. Her entire body went rigid, not from fear, but from recognition. She'd been waiting for this moment for 3 days, watching it approach the way the earth watches a meteor, knowing it was coming, knowing it would change everything, unable to do anything but wait for impact. The knock was heavy, uncertain, not the commanding rap of someone accustomed to obedience, but something raw, something that carried desperation in its very timbre. She didn't move. Not immediately. Instead, she simply held the space between one breath and the next, letting her other senses flood in. His scent was unmistakable sweat and horse, and something deeper, something wild that made her wolf howl even as her human mind screamed at herself to refuse him entry. When she finally opened the door, Nova knew exactly what she would see, even though her eyes saw nothing at all. Dante stood in her doorway like a man who'd been broken down to his component parts, and somehow reassembled himself just enough to function. He was covered in the dust of travel, his fine clothes torn and filthy, his hair matted. But it was his scent that told the real story, the musk of desperation, yes, but underneath that, something else. Something that made Nova's knees threaten to buckle. His wolf recognized her. Had always recognized her. Leave. She said it before he could speak, and the word fell between them like a blade. Dante's hand reached for the doorframe, trembling. His eyes, God's, his eyes were red-rimmed, hollowed out by sleeplessness and grief. "Nova, I said leave." She moved to close the door. Just an inch of movement, but it spoke volumes. This was her sanctuary. This was her territory. This was the one place on Earth where she'd built something that couldn't be destroyed by the rejection of one broken alpha king. But his hand stopped the door. Not forcefully. Just there. A barrier made of flesh and desperation. "My son is dying." The words came out like they'd been torn from somewhere vital. "Please. I know I have no right to ask you. I know I destroyed." Nova cut him off, her voice dropping into something cold and ancient. "You destroyed what we were. You destroyed me. And now you come here expecting what, exactly? Forgiveness? Gratitude? The pleasure of healing the son of the man who called me worthless?" She could feel him flinch at that. Could sense the way the words landed like physical blows. "Did you ever wonder?" Nova continued, her fingers finding the stone wolf pendant at her throat. "In 15 years, did you ever wonder if you were wrong?" The silence that followed was brutal. When Dante finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Every day for 15 years. Nova didn't respond to that. She didn't soften. Instead, she opened the door fully, a gesture that was permission but not welcome, an allowance but not forgiveness. Dante stepped inside, and the sanctuary shifted around him. The very air seemed to recognize him as a threat to the peace they'd built. What would it take? He asked without preamble, and there was something almost feral in the way he moved through her healing chamber, his eyes tracking her with the intensity of a wolf tracking prey. "To help my son?" Nova stood motionless, her fingers still on the stone wolf. "Tell me first, why do you think I can help when all your powerful healers failed?" "Because you're not a healer in the way they are." Dante moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. "You're—" "Say it." She cut him off with a single word, a command that came from somewhere deep inside her that understood power in ways his kingdom never would. Dante's breath caught. "You're more powerful than any of them. You always were. I just didn't want to admit it because I couldn't control you." That admission hung in the air between them, and Nova felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, never that simple, but recognition. The acknowledgement that he understood, at least partially, what his original sin had cost. "I'll help you," she said quietly. "But not for you. For Ronan? For an innocent child who has no blame for his father's sins." She moved toward her shelves of remedies, her fingers knowing exactly where each vial sat without hesitation. "I heal innocence. I've learned to distinguish between who someone is and who the world forced them to become." She could feel him watching her, and she could taste the question he was formulating. When he asked it, his voice was careful. "What do you want in return?" Nova paused, her hands stilled on a bottle of silver moon oil. Something rare, something precious. "I'll tell you when I understand what needs to be healed, because the curse on your son isn't the only thing that's broken in your kingdom." That night, before they left the sanctuary, Nova stood in Dante's presence and let her hands do something they hadn't done since she'd learned to control her power. He'd brought documents, scrolls that detailed everything the kingdom's healers had discovered about the curse. Nova didn't read them. She simply held her hands above the parchment and felt. The sensation was immediate and visceral. Her fingers began to glow that familiar silver white, and her entire body went rigid as she experienced the emotional imprint of whoever had woven this magic into her son's bones. "There's a curse on your son," she said, her voice dropping into something older, something that sounded like it came from the very earth itself. "Yes, we know," Dante began, "but it wasn't placed by an enemy." Nova's eyes sightless, but somehow seeing everything turned toward him. "It was placed by someone close to you. Someone who uses family blood magic. Ancient magic taught only to direct heirs and trusted advisors." She heard the breath catch in his throat. Felt the precise moment understanding began to dawn. That's impossible. My inner circle would never, wouldn't they?" Nova's hands were still glowing, still connected to the curse's origin. "How well do you know the people around you, Dante? Have you ever asked them what they sacrificed to serve you?" The question landed hard. Dante's wolf was rising now. She could sense it clawing at the edges of his human skin, confused and desperate. She continued before he could respond. "The curse is woven with love and betrayal, the most dangerous kind of magic." Nova's voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "Whoever did this loved you once, or loved what you represented. And then something broke. Can you tell me who?" The question was almost pleading. "Not yet. But I can tell you this. Your son's curse is a symptom, not a disease." Nova released the documents, and her glow faded. "The disease is in your kingdom. The disease is that someone close to you is hurting so deeply they're willing to hurt an innocent child to prove a point." "What point?" Dante's voice was hollow. "That power without justice breeds monsters. You've built a kingdom on hierarchy, Dante. And hierarchy, by necessity, creates people who feel they have nothing to lose." The journey back to the castle took them across terrain that Nova navigated with the same perfect certainty she used to move through her sanctuary. But this journey was different. The air crackled with tension between them, not quite hostility, but something equally charged. They'd agreed to travel together, but the agreement came with understanding rather than comfort. Nova had packed a single bag. Dante had offered supplies. She'd refused anything from his kingdom. "The castle is 3 days' journey," Dante had said as they prepared to depart. "I know." Nova's response had been matter of fact. "I can feel it. Can you slow your pace to match mine, or is that beneath a king?" The slight smile that crossed Dante's face had been the first genuine expression she'd seen from him since his arrival. "I can try." And so they traveled together, the Alpha King and the blind Omega Healer, moving through landscapes that seemed to shift and change around them, transforming from the sanctuary's open fields into the kingdom's more structured territories. The further they traveled from the settlement, the more Nova felt the weight of what awaited them pressing down. By the time the castle's shadow fell across their path on the morning of the 3rd day, everything had already begun to change. Chapter 4. Rising tension and the cost of change. The castle gates loomed like the mouth of some ancient beast, and Nova could taste the hierarchy that had been baked into the very stones. This place had been built on dominance. Every archway, every wall, every rigid line of architecture spoke the same language. Power flows downward, obedience flows up, and anyone who doesn't fit the structure is disposable. General Torvin waited at the gates with a contingent of guards. He was old enough to have served Dante's father, old enough to remember when the kingdom's hierarchy had been even more rigid than it was now. When he saw Nova, his entire body went rigid in a way that had nothing to do with military bearing. "My king," he said carefully, his eyes never leaving Nova's face. "You've returned, and this is the Omega?" There was a world of disdain in that single word. Nova felt it land like a physical force, and she stood absolutely still, refusing to react. "This is Nova," Dante said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before the sanctuary. "She's a healer. She's here to save my son's life, and to teach your kingdom a few lessons it's desperately needed," Nova added, her voice carrying that calm certainty that came from knowing with absolute clarity her own worth. "You can stare if you like, General. I won't apologize for existing." She heard several sharp intakes of breath from the guards, saw not with her eyes, but with every other sense at her disposal, the way Torvin's jaw tightened. But Dante simply placed his hand on her shoulder, and the gesture was enough to shift the entire dynamic. They entered the castle. The corridors were exactly as Nova's other senses had told her they would be. Long, rigid, cold, built to intimidate. She could feel the weight of hierarchy pressing down from every surface in the positioning of tapestries, in the height of ceilings designed to make petitioners feel small, in the very air that seemed to carry the scent of dominance. Servants whispered as she passed. Nobles stared with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust. Guards positioned themselves as if she might become a threat at any moment. "Should I clear the corridors?" Dante asked quietly, and there was genuine concern in his voice. "No." Nova's response was immediate and certain. "Let them see. Let them decide what an Omega is capable of when she knows her own worth." She moved through the castle as if she owned it. Not arrogantly, but with the confidence of someone who understood that perception was reality, and if she carried herself like she belonged, eventually the castle would believe it too. By the time they reached Ronan's chamber, the whispers had evolved into something more complex, something that carried less disdain and more uncertainty. The boy lay on a bed that was too large for his small frame, surrounded by luxury that couldn't touch the one thing that actually mattered, his life. Ronan was 8 years old, with his father's dark hair and features that held the particular fragility of childhood illness. The curse marks were visible even to sighted eyes, black veins spreading across his chest like spilled ink, pulsing with a malevolent energy that made Nova's entire body tense. She didn't approach the bed immediately. Instead, she stood in the doorway and simply felt. "Leave us," she said to Dante, her voice brooking no argument. "But I work alone, and your presence is clouding my perception." She didn't turn to look at him. She didn't need to. "Go." When Dante hesitated, Ronan spoke, a small voice made smaller by pain. "Father, she can't see. How will she help me?" Before Dante could respond, Nova moved. She crossed the room with perfect precision, her fingers trailing along furniture she'd never seen, finding her way with the certainty of someone whose other senses had developed the accuracy of sight. She sat beside Ronan's bed and took his hand gently. "I see more clearly than anyone in this castle, child," she said softly. "And what I see is that you're not dying from a curse. You're dying from a betrayal. Let me show you the difference." After Dante left, Nova sat with the boy and simply read the curse the way scholars read books. A curse was never just magic. It was intention made manifest. It was someone's pain crystallized into power. As Nova's hands moved across Ronan's chest, not quite touching, but close enough to perceive, she experienced the emotional landscape of whoever had woven this dark magic. Anger. Yes, there was anger. But underneath that, love. Twisted, broken love. The kind of love that had been rejected so thoroughly it had curdled into something sharp and destructive. And something else. Something Nova recognized with a shock that made her entire body go still. Family magic. Blood magic. Ancient enough to have been passed down through generations, taught only to direct heirs and trusted advisors. The curse had been placed by someone close to Dante. Someone he trusted. Someone who had access to the kingdom's oldest, most protected magic. When she finally left Ronan's chamber, Nova found Dante waiting in the corridor, his face etched with worry and something else, something that looked dangerously like hope. "The curse is stronger than I expected," she told him without preamble, "which means whoever placed it understood you, understood your son, understood enough to weave something that can't be unmade by force alone." His hand reached for her. She stepped back. "Your sister is alive," Nova said flatly. "Somewhere in this castle, and she hates you with the kind of intensity that can only come from familial betrayal." The color drained from Dante's face. My sister died as a child. No, she didn't. Nova's voice was absolute. The scent on that curse carries her. I'd know it anywhere. A girl who loved you, then hated the system that made you matter more than her. The council chamber was exactly what Nova expected. Rigid, hierarchical, filled with the scent of power corrupting itself through stagnation. 3 council elders sat in elevated chairs, Caldorn, who was ancient and rigid, Varen, who was ambitious and dangerous, and Meridus, who was calculating in a way that made Nova's instincts flare. Dante stood before them like a king, but there was something different in his bearing now. Something that suggested the king was being consumed by the man underneath. "My king," Caldorn began, his voice carrying the weight of tradition. "We understand your commitment to securing your son's health. But an Omega healer? The optics alone." "More than optics," Varen interrupted, leaning forward. "It's dangerous. If the kingdom sees their Alpha King accepting an Omega as an authority, the hierarchy collapses." "Perhaps the hierarchy deserves to collapse," Dante said, and Nova felt the shock ripple through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Caldorn's eyes widened. "You're actually considering structural change?" "I'm considering survival," Dante replied. "My son's survival. And yes, perhaps the kingdom's." It was Meridus who spoke next, his voice low and dangerous. "Be careful, Dante. Systems don't enjoy being dismantled. They fight back." The threat was barely veiled. Nova, standing in the shadows where she'd positioned herself to observe, felt her wolf rise in response. This man Meridus was someone to watch, someone who benefited from hierarchy, someone who would resist transformation with everything he had. In the Great Hall, the resistance took a different form. Nova stood near a pillar, listening as nobles gathered in clusters, their whispers building into something that felt dangerously close to conspiracy. Lady Lysandra was among them, a woman whose scent carried ambition and calculation. "An Omega in the castle? As a healer? It's unprecedented." "It's heresy," another voice agreed. "The hierarchy exists for a reason." "And she's blind," a third voice added, and there was something predatory in the tone. "How can someone blind guide anyone?" Lady Lysandra's voice dropped lower. "Perhaps we should help her fail. The king is emotionally compromised. Someone should manage the outcome." Nova noted the woman's scent, committed it to memory. This one was dangerous in the way that internal threats always were motivated, not by loyalty to the kingdom, but by the need to maintain her own position in the hierarchy. Torvin found her in the castle's eastern garden, where Nova had gone to ground herself, to remember the feel of earth and growing things, and the reminder that some systems could be transformed. "My king has lost his mind," the general said without preamble, settling onto a bench beside her. Nova didn't respond immediately. She simply continued running her fingers along the stem of a night-blooming flower, feeling its slow unfurling. "You have loyal people who worry about this path he's taking," Torvin continued. His voice carried concern rather than malice, which made him more dangerous in some ways. "Change, transformation, upheaval. These things destabilize kingdoms. People die when order breaks down. People die from unjust order too," Nova said quietly. "You've just decided not to count them." Torvin flinched at that. There was a long silence. "I'm not your enemy," he said finally. "Neither are the council elders. We're just cautious. Caution is another name for complicity." Nova turned her sightless eyes toward him, and for a moment, the general seemed to feel seen in a way that transcended physical sight. But I think Dante is beginning to understand that now. In Ronan's chamber that night, Nova made her first true attempt at breaking the curse. She dismissed everyone, Dante, the servants, even the guards who'd been stationed outside the door. Alone with the boy, she sat beside his bed and centered herself. A curse was intention made manifest. But intention could be unmade if you understood its source completely enough. If you could touch the emotional wound it had been born from and convince it to choose healing. Nova's hands began to glow. Silver-white light filled the small chamber as she reached out with every sense she possessed, making contact with the curse not through force but through understanding. For a moment, it worked. The black veins faded. Ronan's breathing eased. The boy's small hand gripped hers with something that felt almost like hope, and then the curse pushed back. It wasn't a physical sensation, but something more fundamental. The magic refused to dissolve. It had been woven with such carefully crafted intention, such deeply rooted pain, that it couldn't be unmade simply by someone else's will to heal it. Ronan cried out as the pressure returned. The curse mark spread further across his chest, darker than before. Nova pulled her hands back, and the glow faded. "It didn't work," Ronan whispered. "No." Nova's voice was steady, but her hands trembled with the realization of what this meant. "It didn't. Your curse is stronger than I expected, which means whoever placed it understood you. Understood your father. Understood enough to weave something that can't be unmade by force alone." Later, in the castle's private gardens, Nova faced the choice she'd been avoiding since arriving at the castle. She could heal Ronan's body. She could blur the curse, slow it down, give Dante time to find another solution. She could do her duty to an innocent child and then leave, return to her sanctuary, and pretend she'd tried. But then nothing would change. The kingdom would continue to rot from the inside. The hierarchy would continue to crush anyone who didn't fit its narrow parameters. And in a generation, another child would suffer for someone's twisted sense of justice. "Love isn't just personal," she said aloud to the empty garden. "Love is also political. Love is about wanting better for everyone, not just for the people you care about." She felt Alara's presence before the woman emerged from the shadows. Her second-in-command had ridden to the castle despite Nova's instruction to stay at the sanctuary. "You're choosing to fight," Alara said, settling beside her. "I'm choosing to believe that transformation is possible." Nova's hand found the stone wolf pendant at her throat, even when it costs everything. In the throne room, Dante faced his own reckoning. He stood before his crown, looking at it as if seeing it for the first time. The weight of it seemed almost unbearable, not in its physical mass, but in what it represented: generations of hierarchy. Generations of power built on the backs of those deemed lesser. A messenger arrived with news. Meridus had gathered the northern lords. They were suggesting a solution. They could manage the Omega problem if the king was too weak to do it himself. In other words, if Dante continued down this path of transformation, they would remove him and replace him with someone more traditional. It was an ultimatum, wrapped in concerned language. Dante looked at his crown, and he made a choice. He crumpled the message and set it aside. Then, slowly, deliberately, he placed the crown on the table rather than on his head. "I've spent so long holding power," he said to the empty throne room, "that I forgot true strength is giving it away." Dawn breaks over the castle. Nova and Dante stand in a private garden, and the conversation that will define their alliance and their path forward is about to begin. The kingdom is fracturing at its seams, and they are the only two people who understand what needs to happen next. Chapter 5. The Architect of Lies. The study was small and intimate, which made the revelation feel even more brutal. Nova stood with absolute certainty before a table scattered with scrolls and correspondence, her sightless eyes somehow more penetrating than any that could actually see. Dante paced behind her, his wolf barely contained beneath his skin, restless, confused, desperate for answers that his human mind wasn't prepared to accept. "Your sister will come when I call her," Nova said simply. There was no drama in the statement, no flourish, just fact. "She's been waiting for you to understand the truth." Dante's step faltered. "How is she alive? How is she in my castle?" "Because she's been queen consort." Nova's fingers trailed across a particular scroll, not reading it in any conventional sense, but sensing it. "She's been hiding in plain sight, hidden inside the very power structure that tried to erase her." The implication landed like a physical blow. "Call for your queen consort," Nova continued, her voice carrying that particular authority that came from knowing something no one else did. "I believe her name is Isolde now, though she was known by another name in your childhood." The study fell silent. Dante's breathing became audible, sharp, uncontrolled, the breathing of a man watching his entire understanding of the world fracture like ice under spring thaw. When Lady Isolde entered the study moments later, she already knew. She moved with the grace of someone accustomed to power, but there was something different in her bearing, now a tautness, as if every muscle had gone rigid in preparation for impact. She was beautiful in a sharp-edged way, with Dante's dark hair and eyes that held the particular coldness of someone who'd learned to survive by becoming as hard as the system that tried to crush her. Isolde. Dante's voice barely functioned. You can't be. Hello, brother. Her response was perfectly modulated, perfectly controlled. Did you miss me? I mourned you. The words came out broken, fractured. I believed you were dead. Mother believed you were dead. Everyone believed. That's what I wanted you to believe. Isolde's gaze moved to Nova, then back to Dante. There was no triumph in her expression, only a terrible inevitability. It was easier to serve your kingdom when no one knew the queen's sister was in the room. She said it like someone discussing the weather. Like discussing the death of her own identity was simply part of the price of survival. Nova's voice cut through the tension like a blade. You placed the curse on your nephew. You used royal blood magic, the kind that can only be taught to direct heirs. Why? Isolde didn't answer Nova. She looked at her brother instead, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 15 years of silence. Do you remember what Father told me? On the day of your 16th birthday celebration? Dante shook his head mutely. He said, Isolde, you're clever, but Dante will be king. Such is the way of alphas. She paused, and for a moment, something raw flickered across her face, something that looked dangerously like the girl she'd been before the world had told her she didn't matter. That sentence, that decision made right there in front of the entire court. That's when I died, Dante, even though my heart kept beating for another 22 years. Nova found Isolde alone in the castle library hours later, sitting in absolute darkness, though of course, darkness meant nothing to either of them in the way it meant something to sighted creatures. You're not evil, Nova said without preamble, moving through the shadows with the certainty of someone who'd learned to navigate through senses that transcended sight. You're just broken the way the system breaks everyone who doesn't fit its narrow parameters. Isolde's head lifted, and for a moment, there was genuine shock in her expression. She'd expected judgment, condemnation, possibly violence. But understanding? That was something she clearly hadn't anticipated. You're defending me? The question came out almost as an accusation. I'm not defending you, Nova said, settling into a chair beside her. I'm grieving the girl you could have been if someone had taught you that your worth wasn't measured by a crown or a throne or a place in a hierarchy that never wanted you anyway. Isolde's breathing became audible, the breathing of someone struggling to hold themselves together. You had an alternative. You built a sanctuary. I didn't have that option. I was born into the palace, destined to watch my brother inherit everything while I inherited nothing. The emptiness. The invisible space where I should have mattered. When I cursed Ronan, Isolde continued, and her voice dropped into something raw and honest. I wasn't trying to kill him. I was trying to force Dante to understand, to suffer, to feel the powerlessness I've felt my entire life, every single moment since our father decided that my gender and my birth order meant I was somehow less. Nova remained silent. She understood the difference between interrupting and listening, between responding and witnessing. I know what I did was monstrous, Isolde whispered. Ronan is innocent. I know that now. But when I placed the curse, I was so angry I couldn't see innocence. I could only see my brother's future, the legacy I'd never have, the crown that was never meant for me, no matter how clever I was, no matter how strategic or powerful or capable. What you need, Nova said, and her voice carried something almost like tenderness, is a different kind of power. Not the power to rule through dominance, but the power to be seen, to be valued. Not because you infiltrated the system, but because you're willing to challenge it. For the first time, Isolde looked directly at the blind Omega, who somehow saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. If you'd been born an Omega like me, Nova continued, you would have learned to find strength in powerlessness. You would have been forced to build community instead of seeking dominance. Instead, you were born into a system that taught you to hunger for power because it was the only language the world spoke. Different paths, same wound. Isolde's face crumbled. For a moment, the carefully constructed facade of the queen consort shattered completely, revealing the frightened girl underneath. How are you not angry? Oh, I am, Nova said simply, furious. But anger at a broken system is different from anger at a broken person. You're a person, Isolde. Just broken the same way I was broken. Can it be fixed? Can I be fixed? You were never broken, Nova replied. You were just forced into a shape that didn't fit. The question isn't whether you can be fixed. The question is whether you're willing to be remade. The throne room held a weight that felt almost tangible when Nova, Isolde, and Dante stood together in its vast space, three people who represented the old order fracturing, the system recognizing itself as a lie. Why didn't you come to me? Dante's voice was hollow, haunted. Why didn't you tell me you were alive? Because I needed you to fail, Isolde said, and there was no cruelty in the statement, just terrible honesty. I needed you to understand what failure felt like, what it meant to be powerless. Nova stepped forward slightly. She's right, Dante. You needed to fail. Otherwise you'd never have changed. And cursing my son? The question came out like a weapon turned inward. That was necessary too? Yes. Isolde didn't soften the word. I'm sorry, but yes. Sometimes we hurt innocents to wake the guilty. Sometimes the system's violence requires a mirror held up to show the king what he's built. Which is exactly why we need systems that don't require innocents to be sacrificed for the guilty to learn, Nova said quietly. Why we need to dismantle hierarchy entirely. Dante looked between them, the blind healer who'd orchestrated all of this, the sister who'd been dead for 15 years, the revelation that everything he'd built was constructed on a foundation of lies. I'm sorry, Isolde, he said finally, and the words seemed to cost him something fundamental. I'm sorry that Father's words meant more to me than my sister's presence. I'm sorry that I chose hierarchy over you. I'm sorry that I let a system erase you. Isolde's breath caught. For a moment she couldn't speak, and I'm sorry, she said eventually, her voice thick with emotion she'd buried for years. That I chose power over revolution. That I tried to hurt you from inside the system instead of standing against it. That I let the hierarchy make me into its weapon instead of becoming my own. Nova watched them both, these two broken people, connected by blood and betrayal, beginning to understand that they'd both been victims of the same architecture of lies. Where do we go from here? Dante asked. You tell the kingdom the truth, Nova said. All of it. You tell them that your hierarchy is built on lies, that it destroys people who are just trying to survive, that it forced a sister to curse her own nephew to be heard, and then you dismantle it. That night, Nova stood in the castle library alone, and she did something she hadn't done in front of another person in over a decade. She held a scroll before her, and she read it. Not with her fingers, not through sensation or scent, or any of the alternative methods people assumed she used. She read it the way anyone with functional eyes would read perception flowing directly into comprehension. Her sightless eyes tracked across the parchment, taking in the written words, understanding their meaning with perfect clarity. A map of the castle's hidden passages, a document detailing Isolde's movements, evidence of her presence. Nova had known where Isolde was for weeks. She'd traced her scent through the castle's corridors, felt the particular resonance of her magic, understood her hiding place with the same absolute certainty. She understood everything else. She'd been waiting for Dante to become someone worthy of the truth. When Isolde found her there reading in the darkness, no guide, no cane, no assistance, shock rippled across the woman's face. How are you reading without eyes? Nova set the scroll aside carefully. There are other ways to see, Isolde. Older ways. Ways that don't require light or physical vision. Ways that see essence rather than surface. You can actually see. It wasn't a question. You've been able to see this whole time. Nova turned toward the woman, and in that moment, she chose what to reveal and what to withhold. What I can do doesn't matter as much as what people believe I can do. Everyone underestimates the blind. They assume limitation instead of possibility. That underestimation is my greatest weapon. She stood, moving with the grace of someone who'd navigated this space thousands of times because of course she had. Blindness had never been her limitation. It had been her choice. The truth is more complex than either blindness or sight. Nova continued. The truth is that I've been choosing what to see and what to hide, and it's time for the kingdom to understand the difference. Chapter 6. The King's Reckoning. The throne room was packed. Every surface held bodies nobility in their finest silks and jewels positioned toward the front, soldiers standing rigid in formation, commoners crowded into the spaces at the back, their faces reflecting the particular hunger of people who'd never been allowed inside spaces of power before. The air itself felt charged with anticipation. Everyone understood that something fundamental was about to shift. The king had summoned the entire kingdom for a proclamation, and rumors had spread like wildfire through the castle corridors. Dante stood beside the throne rather than sitting upon it. The gesture was so deliberate, so calculated in its symbolism, that everyone in the chamber felt it immediately a king, positioning himself next to power, rather than sitting upon it. When he spoke, his voice carried across the vast space with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding armies, but there was something different in his tone now. Something that sounded like truth, rather than command. For generations we have built our society on a hierarchy that serves only those at the top, he began. We have called omegas weak, we have feared blindness, we have used the name unfit to justify cruelty and continue systems that destroy the people we deemed unsuitable. Nova stood with the other omegas, and she felt the moment when the kingdom's understanding began to shift, felt the collective intake of breath, the rustling of fabric as conservative nobles stiffened in their chairs. Today, I declare that hierarchy a lie, Dante continued. Today, I acknowledge that an omega healed what all my power could not. An omega with blindness that was supposed to be her limitation became her greatest strength. A blind omega saved my son's life when 63 of our most powerful healers failed. His eyes found Nova in the crowd, and for a moment, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. Today I confess that the blind girl I rejected years ago possessed more wisdom than all my advisors combined, Dante said. And I'm going to spend the rest of my reign trying to become someone worthy of her forgiveness. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to touch every surface in the throne room. The laws of this kingdom will change, Dante announced. Omegas will have legal standing equal to alphas and betas. Betas will have genuine voice in governance. Those deemed unfit by the old order will be recognized as vital to our survival. And this transformation is not a suggestion, it is a mandate. It is the new order of Silverspire. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then the Omegas began to stand. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, every Omega in that throne room rose to their feet. Not in obedience, but in recognition. In acknowledgement that something had shifted fundamentally. Several betas followed, younger warriors who'd been questioning the hierarchy for years finally given permission to do so. But the older alphas, the conservative nobles, they remained seated. Some of them left the chamber entirely, their departure a statement in itself. They refused to witness what was coming, and from the back of the chamber, a single voice cut through the moment like a blade. Council Elder Caldern stood, his ancient face twisted with fury. My king, if you're serious about this, understand the consequence. The northern packs will see this as weakness. They will see opportunity. We'll face rebellion. Blood will spill. Dante didn't hesitate. He descended from the platform and walked toward the elder with a deliberateness that seemed to slow time itself. I've spent so long holding power, Dante said, and his voice carried something that sounded like grief, that I forgot true strength is giving it away. If we must spill blood to build justice, then that blood is on my hands. Not on the kingdom's conscience, not on the innocent people I've been crushing under the weight of hierarchy. He stopped in front of Caldorn, and when he spoke next, his voice dropped into something intimate, something that only the elder could hear but everyone understood. I'm gambling that people, when given a choice between hierarchy and justice, will choose justice. I'm gambling that change is possible, and I'm gambling that love matters more than power. Caldorn's face went white. He turned and left the chamber without another word. General Torvin's resignation came within hours. Dante received him in his private study, and there was no anger in the old warrior's expression, only sadness. Only the particular grief of a man watching the world he understood dissolve around him. I've served you faithfully for 30 years, Torvin said, and his voice shook slightly. But I cannot serve a kingdom built on what you're proposing. I'm stepping down. Dante didn't try to convince him otherwise. I understand. Go with honor, Torvin. I hope you find peace in whatever future you choose. The general's response was almost a whisper. I hope you survive yours. But the real challenge came from the north. Within days, messengers began arriving with troubling news. Counselor Meredith had sent out calls to the northern pacts, to the conservative lords, to the alphas who'd built their entire power structure on dominance and hierarchy. They were gathering forces. They were organizing. They were preparing for war against their own king. It was an ultimatum dressed in concern: accept traditional hierarchy or face rebellion. A younger general, a beta named Cassian, brought Dante the reports, and the king felt his world shift once again. What are your orders? Cassian asked carefully. Do we prepare for offense? Do we march north preemptively? Dante closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision. We don't start this war, but we don't lose it either. Prepare for defense, not aggression. We're not fighting to maintain power, Cassian. We're fighting for the right to transform. There's a difference. While Dante navigated the political minefield, Nova worked with the newly empowered Omegas to organize something unprecedented. They weren't preparing for traditional warfare. Instead, they were building the infrastructure of a new society, establishing relief efforts for communities that had been crushed under hierarchy, organizing training programs to help Omegas understand their own power, creating defensive networks that prioritized protection rather than dominance. Nova moved through these efforts with the grace of someone who'd been preparing for this moment since she first opened the exiled settlement. She taught young Omegas that they didn't need to become what the system had told them to become. They could simply choose what they would be. We're not fighting a war we're not prepared for, she told them, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who understood power in ways most people never would. We're building a society that's worth defending. One young Omega girl, barely old enough to have shifted for the first time, asked with genuine fear in her voice, But won't they kill us? Some of us, yes, Nova said with brutal honesty. But we're already being killed. The hierarchy has been killing us slowly for generations. At least now we're dying for something we chose. At least now we're fighting for a future we believe in. The moment of almost came late one night, in a private courtyard within the castle where the stars were visible, and the world felt, for a moment, less fractured. Dante found Nova standing alone, her fingers trailing along the stone of an ancient fountain, reading the texture the way most people read faces. You've been avoiding me, he said quietly. She didn't deny it. Yes. Why? Nova turned to face him, and even without sight, she seemed to see him completely. Because I love you, Dante. And right now, love is a luxury we can't afford. The kingdom is at war with itself. People are dying not yet, but soon, and I need to be able to make decisions without considering how they affect you. His wolf wanted to howl at that, wanted to claim what it recognized as mate, wanted to reject this separation, but Dante's human mind understood the necessity of it. What about how they affect you? He asked quietly. I can sacrifice my heart if it means a better future, Nova said. Can you? The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. When this is over, Dante said eventually. When the kingdom is stable, when the fighting is done, will you let me ask you something? Like what? Like whether you could ever forgive me enough to build something with me, something real, not as king and subject, but as equals. Nova was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was soft but absolute. Maybe. When we've earned the right to be happy, we can talk about happiness. Right now, I need you to be a good king, not a good lover. How do I do both? You lead the kingdom toward justice, she said. And you trust me to lead the Omegas toward their own power. We meet in the middle when the road is safer. He wanted to argue. His wolf wanted to claim. But instead, Dante simply stepped closer and inhaled her scent, committing it to memory, anchoring himself to it. The morning of her departure, Nova packed a single bag. She was going to establish sanctuary cities across the kingdom, places where Omegas could gather, could learn their own power, could build community outside the capital. It was a mission, not a retreat. It was her choosing to transform her personal sanctuary into a kingdom-wide revolution. Dante watched her prepare with the grim understanding that this was the cost of genuine change. Love couldn't be prioritized when a kingdom was burning. When will I see you again? He asked as she finished securing her bag. When the Northern Rebellion is crushed, and the kingdom is stable, Nova replied. When you can look me in the eyes and know you chose transformation over power. When I'm no longer wondering if you'll choose hierarchy again the moment things get difficult. I won't, Dante said with absolute certainty. I know, Nova replied, but I need you to prove it. Not to me, to yourself. She moved toward the door, and Dante let her go, because this time, it wasn't about powerlessness. This time, it was about choosing to trust that they would find each other again. Her wolf form emerged as she stepped into the courtyard, the shift happening with the grace of someone who understood their animal self as completely as their human one. She paused for just a moment, looking back at the castle, at Dante standing in the doorway. Then she ran. Her paws barely touched the earth as she disappeared into the forest, carrying with her the future of the kingdom and the broken heart of a king who'd finally learned to let go. Love isn't always about holding on, Dante whispered to the empty courtyard. Sometimes it's about letting go. Sometimes it's about trusting someone to become worthy of you while you become worthy of them. And somewhere in the distance, Nova's wolf howled not in pain, but in recognition. In acknowledgement that they were partners now, separated not by hierarchy or rejection, but by the sacred work of transformation that only they could do. The kingdom fractures further as the Northern Rebellion grows stronger. Nova establishes her sanctuary network across the realm, building power among the Omegas. Dante rules from a throne he's learning to diminish, and somewhere in the space between them, love becomes political. Love becomes revolutionary. Love becomes the only thing worth fighting for. Chapter 7. The Marking. Secrets revealed. The night had fallen completely when Nova materialized in Dante's private chambers, like a ghost taking solid form. He was alone, standing before the window that overlooked the kingdom he'd spent weeks learning to dismantle. His wolf was restless beneath his skin. She could smell it, could taste the agitation in his scent. He'd been waiting for her. Somehow, impossibly, he'd known she would come. How did you get past the guards? His voice carried shock but no real surprise. On some level, his animal consciousness had recognized her the moment she entered the room. I've always been able to move past what people decide to see. Nova's voice was calm, certain. She didn't need eyes to navigate his chambers perfectly. She moved with the grace of someone who'd walked these halls 1,000 times. Guards stop looking when they assume nothing's there. Dante turned to face her, and the moment their scents mingled, his wolf howled. You came back, he said, and the words sounded like a prayer and a plea simultaneously. I never left, Nova replied. I just wasn't visible. There's a difference. She crossed the chamber with that unsettling precision, and Dante realized with a jolt that she wasn't navigating by touch or sound or any of the methods he'd assumed she used. She was moving through space with the certainty of someone who could see it. There's something I need to tell you, Nova said, and her voice had changed, deepened into something older, something that carried the weight of secrets carefully kept, something I should have told you in the sanctuary, but I needed to be sure first. Sure of what? Sure that you'd changed. She stepped closer, and her sightless eyes somehow managed to be more penetrating than any that could actually perceive light. Sure that you understood the depth of what you'd done to me. Sure that this kingdom could support a truth that might destabilize everything again. Dante's breathing became shallow. What truth? Nova's hand moved to her throat, to the neckline of her dress. She pulled it aside slowly, deliberately, revealing the mark that had been hidden beneath layers of fabric and careful positioning for 15 years. A wolf encircling a crescent moon, glowing faintly with power that transcended physical light. You marked me, Dante, she said quietly. The night your wife died, you marked me as your true mate. The world seemed to tilt. But I never... Dante's voice fractured. I don't remember... Your wolf knew, Nova said. Your wolf recognized me before your mind could accept it, while you were drowning in grief. While your human consciousness was fracturing under the weight of loss, your animal nature made a choice. It claimed what it recognized as belonging to it. She pulled her hand away from the mark, and it continued to glow softly. And I felt it. Every single moment since that night, I've felt it. A connection that shouldn't have existed given everything that passed between us. A bond that refused to break no matter how much time or distance or deliberate rejection we poured between us. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out ragged. Because a mark made in desperation, out of grief, twisted together with love, twisted even further that mark isn't worth honoring until the person who made it understands what they're actually claiming. Nova's sightless eyes tracked his face with impossible accuracy. I needed you to choose me. Not because your wolf had already chosen, but because your human heart, your conscious mind, your evolved understanding had finally caught up. The question came hours later, in the darkness before dawn, when they'd simply sat together not touching, but present to one another in a way that felt more intimate than any physical contact could be. Nova, I need to ask you something, Dante said slowly. And I need a direct answer. Can you see? The silence that followed stretched like something alive. Yes, she said finally. One word, one syllable. And it contained the weight of every lie she'd ever told him, every assumption he'd made, every moment he'd felt protective of her because of her perceived limitation. What? His voice came out strangled. For how long? Since when? Since I was 30 years old. Nova's voice remained perfectly steady, perfectly calm. I woke up one morning, and the blindness had lifted. My eyes worked fine. I could see the kingdom, see the sanctuary, see everything I'd been navigating by feel for over a decade. Dante stood, his wolf rising in response to the betrayal, the revelation. And you just kept pretending to be blind? I did. He wanted to rage at her. His animal wanted to shift and howl and demand answers. But instead, he found himself frozen by the absolute certainty in her voice. There was no apology in it, no defensiveness, just fact. Why? The question came out almost as a whisper. Nova stood as well, and she moved toward him with that maddening precision. When I first saw the world again, I realized something terrifying. I could see the pity in people's eyes. I could read the judgment in their glances. I could perceive the hierarchy embedded in every casual look. Sight meant seeing all the cruelty disguised as concern, all the assumption hidden beneath supposed sympathy. She paused, letting the words settle. So I chose to live as the blind girl the world already knew, she continued. Because in that blindness, I possessed power the sighted could never access. I couldn't be judged by my appearance. I couldn't be diminished by a glance. I had to be understood, through essence, through the core of who I was, not through the surface of how I looked. Did you ever think about telling me? The hurt in his voice was unmistakable. I was waiting to see if you would learn to value blindness, Nova said, or if you'd still see it as something to overcome, whether you'd accept limitation as power or continue to view it as weakness that needed correcting. Dante felt something crystallize inside him, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. You've been orchestrating everything, moving through my castle unseen, reading the political currents, orchestrating the revelation of Isolde, the organization of the Omegas, the path toward transformation. Yes, Nova said simply. I could navigate your kingdom without being visible because everyone assumed a blind woman was less capable than a sighted one. I used their assumption against them. I used their prejudice as a weapon. And I did it all without ever lying about who I am. You've been playing the entire kingdom, Dante said, and there was something almost like admiration beneath the accusation. No, Nova replied. I've been teaching the kingdom to see. I've been showing them that their assumptions are wrong, that the blind might perceive clearer than the sighted. That power isn't about eyes or sight or external perception. It's about understanding. It's about knowing what you are without needing anyone else's validation to confirm it. Dante moved closer to her, unable to resist the pull. And us? Have you been playing me? Never, Nova said, and her voice carried something so raw, so absolutely certain, that his wolf stilled completely. I loved you before my blindness. I loved you during my blindness. I love you now, with my eyes open and my power completely revealed. But I needed you to understand something fundamental. My worth isn't dependent on your perception of me. Whether I can see or not, I matter. That's what I've been trying to teach you all along. The anger came first, sharp and clean and almost relieving in its intensity. Dante paced the chamber like a caged animal, his wolf pacing in parallel beneath his skin. You manipulated me, he said. You used the assumption of my own blindness to lead me exactly where you wanted me to go. Yes, Nova said without hedging. How is that love? His voice rose. How is that anything but control? Love isn't about control, Nova replied, and her voice never wavered despite the fury in his. But love sometimes requires directing someone toward truth they're too afraid to face. I didn't manipulate you, Dante. I showed you reality. I forced you to confront what you'd built and why you'd built it. I made you choose transformation instead of allowing you to drift into it accidentally. You could have told me, Dante said. You could have trusted me with the truth. Could I? Nova's response came like a counterattack. Would you have listened to a blind Omega girl if she'd approached you as an equal? Or would you have patronized her, tried to help her, maintained the hierarchy we've spent months dismantling? Would you have seen her as a threat or a subject? The question hung between them, unanswerable because they both knew the truth. Slowly, Dante's anger transformed. It didn't disappear, it evolved. What you did. It was necessary, wasn't it? If you'd come to me as fully powerful, as completely capable, I would have been threatened. I would have competed for dominance, instead of surrendering to transformation. Yes, Nova said simply. So you sacrificed honesty for effectiveness. I sacrificed one form of honesty for a deeper truth, Nova replied. You now understand something you could never have understood if I'd appeared as a threat. You've experienced vulnerability. You've learned that power doesn't come from dominance. You've discovered that transformation requires surrender. Dante felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition, and beneath that recognition, something that felt dangerously like awe. You're more powerful than I am, he said quietly. You always have been. I think I've always known that, but I needed you to show me in a way I could accept. I'm not more powerful, Nova said. I'm simply more certain of my power. I know what I am without needing anyone's validation. I understand my strength doesn't diminish anyone else's. I've integrated every part of myself, the blindness and the sight, the healing and the fighting, the vulnerability and the control. When Dante asked the question, it came from his human heart rather than his wolf. Will you stand beside me as we rebuild this kingdom? Not as a subject, not as a healer, as an equal? Yes, Nova said. If you truly understand what that means. It means I'll challenge you. It means you can't hide behind the crown. It means everything you do will be questioned and scrutinized and tested. I want that, Dante said. I need that. I need someone who isn't afraid of me. I was never afraid of you, Nova replied. I was afraid of what you represented. But we're dismantling that now, together. And as they spoke, something extraordinary happened. The mate mark on Nova's collarbone began to glow, not with faint luminescence, but with power that lit the entire chamber in silver-white radiance. And on Dante's chest, where he'd never consciously marked himself but where his wolf had claimed its mate years ago, an invisible mark began to manifest a counterpart to Nova's, creating a pattern that bound them together at a level that transcended physical form. Do you feel that? Nova whispered. Yes, Dante said. What is it? Your wolf recognizing me, Nova said, and mine recognizing you, not as a claim, not as a possession, as an acknowledgement. We're mated, Dante. Actually mated. Not just marked by desperation and grief, bonded by choice. I didn't think that was possible for us, Dante admitted. I thought we were too broken. We were, Nova said, but we've done the work. We've seen each other truly. We've experienced what it means to be powerless and powerful simultaneously, and now the bond can actually form. She took his hands, and the moment her skin touched his, the world inverted. Dante experienced a moment of disorientation, a shift in perception so profound it felt like his consciousness was being rewritten. For just an instant, he saw through Nova's senses rather than his own. He saw the kingdom not as hierarchy and structure, but as potential, as connection, as a web of possibilities that transcended dominance and submission. He saw himself as she'd always seen him, not as the powerful king, but as a man learning to surrender. He saw Nova as she truly was, not as a limitation overcome, but as integrated wholeness that contained multitudes. And when the vision released him, he gasped like a man surfacing from drowning. "How have you been carrying this?" he asked, his voice shaking. "This much perception? This much understanding?" "I learned that the more you can see truly," Nova replied, "the more responsibility you have to speak truth. That's why I couldn't stay silent, even when silence would have been easier." The mate bond glows between them, acknowledged and accepted. But outside the castle walls, forces are gathering. The northern rebellion grows stronger. And somewhere in the shadows of the kingdom, someone watches Nova with calculating eyes. Not in love, in fear. And fear, as they're about to learn, is far more dangerous than hate. Chapter 8. The Conspiracy, When Change Threatens Power. The gardens were peaceful that afternoon, and Nova had allowed herself the luxury of a moment's peace with young Ronan. They walked among the healing herbs, moonflower and bloodroot, and the delicate night bloom that only opened under stars. The boy was learning to read plants the way Nova read people through touch and scent, and the particular vibration that each growing thing emitted. But then Nova's entire body went rigid. It wasn't a sound that alerted her. It wasn't a visible threat. It was something deeper, a disturbance in the energy that permeated the castle, a wrongness that felt like poison seeping into water. "Nova?" Ronan's voice carried concern. "Are you scared?" "The advisors said Father's battle will be difficult. Fear is just information," Nova said, her voice dropping into something ancient and commanding. "It means something is coming. Something we need to prepare for." She tilted her head, and her nostrils flared. The scents were coming from multiple directions, at least a dozen of them. Female scents carrying the particular musk of compulsion magic. Dark magic, binding magic, magic that made people do things against their will. "Go find General Torvin," Nova instructed Ronan, her tone brooking no argument. "Tell him Nova needs the castle guards doubled immediately. Tell him we're under threat." "But there's no alarm," Ronan protested. "Trust me," Nova said simply. The boy ran, and Nova remained perfectly still in the garden, every sense extended outward, reading the approaching danger the way a seer might read cards. 12 assassins, all female, all marked with compulsion magic they clearly despised. Someone had sent them, someone within the castle, someone who believed an Omega Queen threatened the kingdom more than civil war. Alara arrived within the hour, her wolf having felt Nova's summons through the bond they'd cultivated over years of working together. "They're coming tonight," Nova told her quietly. "Assassins, sent by someone who wants me dead, or wants to prove that an Omega can't be protected in her own kingdom." "How many?" Alara's voice was steady despite the danger. 12. All female, all bound by compulsion magic that they don't want to be bound by. "Can you stop them?" "Yes," Nova said simply. "But I need you to understand something, Alara. These women aren't my enemies. They're victims. Someone put them in compulsion and sent them to kill. I can stop them, but I can also free them." Alara understood. That was the difference between Nova's justice and the kingdom's traditional approach. Other queens might have executed 12 assassins without hesitation. Nova would free them. Als night fell, Nova prepared. Not with weapons. She didn't need them. Instead, she centered herself, drawing power from the deepest parts of her, being the parts that were both Omega and warrior, both healer and fighter, both predator and nurturer. "I've spent my life being perceived as fragile," she whispered to the darkness of her chamber. "As someone who needed protection, as an Omega, and therefore vulnerable. But tonight, I'm going to show this kingdom what an Omega truly is." She felt her wolf rise beneath her skin, not with aggression, but with purpose. The assassins emerged from the castle walls at midnight like shadows given form. 12 female werewolves, moving with trained precision, their eyes empty of will or choice. They carried the particular stench of compulsion magic chains that bound not the body but the mind. The lead assassin's voice was harsh, guttural, forced. "The Omega whore must die. The king cannot marry beneath his station." They moved toward Ronan's chamber with the single-minded determination of people whose choices had been stolen. But Nova stepped from the darkness, and the world shifted. "You were given this mission against your will," she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "I can smell the compulsion magic on your skin. It tastes like chains." The lead assassin hesitated one moment of confusion, of the truth trying to break through the magical binding, and that moment was all Nova needed. Her body began to shift, but not into the traditional werewolf form that most people knew. Her transformation was something far older, far more primal. Her bones restructured themselves, but instead of pain, there was purpose. Her muscles expanded with controlled power. And then, her form became luminous. Silver-white light enveloped her body, so bright it forced the assassins to shield their eyes. Her wolf form emerged, not as a monster, but as something transcendent covered in ancient symbols that glowed with the power of centuries, her eyes burning like twin moons, her fur seeming to contain entire galaxies. This was the healing wolf. The rare, legendary form that appeared once every few generations among Omegas. This was Nova's true nature. Not a limitation, but a gateway to something beyond what most people could even comprehend. "The healing wolf," the lead assassin whispered, and in her voice was terror and recognition, and the breaking of the compulsion that had bound her. Nova moved. Not with brutality, but with absolute precision. She didn't seek to destroy, she sought to disarm, to disable, to stop. The first assassin fell with barely a touch Nova's teeth, coming close enough to draw blood without severing veins. A warning, a statement. The second assassin tried to shift and run. Nova moved faster than anything living should be able to move, her luminous body seeming to blur through space itself. The assassin crashed against a wall, disarmed but alive. The third, fourth, and fifth fell in quick succession, each one experiencing the same realization. They were outmatched not by force but by certainty. By the absolute power that came from knowing exactly what you were. By the seventh assassin, the remaining group began to flee. But they weren't running from Nova. They were running from the compulsion magic that was finally breaking, from the realization that they'd been used, enslaved, sent to die for someone else's agenda. The last assassin, the 12th, dropped to her knees on the castle floor, trembling with the effort of fighting against compulsion that was still burning in her veins. Nova shifted back to human form, her body glowing with the fading radiance of her wolf's power. She was naked, ethereal, terrible in her beauty and certainty. She knelt beside the woman and did what only Nova could do. She healed her. Nova's hands glowed as she placed them on the assassin's forehead. She reached into the woman's mind and unmade the compulsion magic not by fighting it, but by understanding it, by recognizing the pain that had been used to create it, the desperation that had powered it, the coercion that had shaped it. The dark magic dissolved like smoke, leaving behind a woman gasping for air, for understanding, for the return of her own will. Why am I here?" the assassin whispered, tears streaming down her face as consciousness fully returned. "Because someone powerful wanted me dead," Nova said gently. "And they used compulsion magic to force you to do their bidding. But you're free now. Who sent you?" The woman's eyes cleared, filled with the particular hatred that came from recognizing one's own enslavement. "Lady Margot, the king's cousin. She said the Omega was a threat to the kingdom. She said if Dante married you, it would destabilize everything. She said we'd be paid handsomely for the job." It took only hours for the truth to emerge. Lady Margot was brought before Nova and the council, and the woman's fury was absolute. She screamed at the assassins she'd hired, called them weak for failing, demanded they explain why a single Omega had defeated all of them. "You were weak!" Margot shrieked. "All of you! An Omega should have died to a simple compulsion spell." Nova's voice was cold, cutting through the rage like a blade. "An Omega, you're right, but not a simple one. And that's what you never understood, Margot. You were so focused on hierarchy that you couldn't see actual power when it was standing in front of you. You destroyed everything." Margot's voice cracked. "You promised nothing, yet you somehow became everything. How is that fair?" "It's not fair," Nova replied. "But fairness isn't the opposite of hierarchy, justice is. And you chose to defend hierarchy instead of reaching for justice." In that moment, Nova understood Margot completely. She was a woman caught between powers too low in the hierarchy to ever truly be safe, too invested in hierarchy to ever truly be free. She'd struck out to preserve her position not from malice, but from the terror of losing the only thing she'd ever been taught to value. Isolde cursed your son because she was desperate to be seen, Nova told Dante and the council. Margot sent assassins because she was desperate to maintain status. Both women were harmed by your hierarchy, but they responded differently. One wanted to destroy the system from within. One wanted to preserve it. And what do you want, Nova? Dante asked. To dismantle it completely, Nova said. To build something where women like Isolde and Margot never have to choose between desperation and defense. Where their worth isn't measured against a crown or a position or a place in a hierarchy that never wanted them anyway. The news spread through the kingdom like wildfire. The blind Omega had fought 12 assassins. The blind Omega had won. The blind Omega had glowed like ancient legend. The blind Omega was more powerful than anyone had imagined. Different groups interpreted the revelation differently. Conservative alphas saw a threat. Commoners saw a protector. Omegas saw proof that their power had never been the problem. The world's refusal to see it had been the problem. Young Ronan spoke to Dante about it that night, his young eyes still wide with wonder and fear in equal measure. She was so beautiful, Father, the boy said, but also terrifying. Is she dangerous? Only to those who threaten the innocent, Dante replied, and in his voice was pride and recognition of something far deeper than traditional power. That's what real power looks like, Ronan. Not dominance. Not force. The ability to protect without cruelty. The council met in urgent session, and even Caldorn, always the most rigid defender of hierarchy, seemed shaken. An Omega with that kind of power, he said, could tear this kingdom apart if she wanted to. But she hasn't, a younger council member replied. She's used her power to protect, not to conquer. Maybe the transformation is actually working. From the back of the chamber, Aldous watched with calculating eyes. Or maybe she's simply waiting for the right moment. Maybe she's biding her time, gathering power, preparing to take what she wants. But no one listened to his fear-mongering. Something fundamental had shifted in the kingdom's understanding. The blind Omega wasn't a threat to be managed. She was a force to be honored. Later that night, Nova and Dante stood in the castle's private quarters, and Dante asked the question that had been haunting him. After tonight, the kingdom knows what you're capable of. Does that change anything for you? It changes everything and nothing, Nova replied. I always knew what I was capable of. Now the kingdom does too. That's all. Are you afraid they'll see you as a threat instead of a savior? Dante, I've never needed them to see me as a savior, Nova said, and her sightless eyes somehow managed to be more penetrating than physical sight. I needed them to see me as a person. If my power frightens them into treating me like one, then that's acceptable. The morning light breaks over the castle, and Nova stands at the gates of the great cathedral. The ceremony is about to begin. The kingdom is holding its breath. And somewhere in that cathedral, the final truth is about to be revealed, one that will transform not just Nova and Dante, but the entire understanding of power itself. The blind girl is about to teach the kingdom how to truly see. Chapter 9. The Wedding. Truth Unveiled. The cathedral held its breath as dawn broke over Silver Spire. Millions of candles had been lit throughout the night, turning the sacred space into something that transcended architecture, a physical manifestation of hope. The cathedral's vaulted ceiling seemed to stretch into infinity, and every visible surface had been decorated, not with symbols of hierarchy, but with representations of all the castes, alpha runes, beta symbols, and omega marks woven together in patterns that suggested equality rather than subordination. The people had begun arriving before first light. Thousands of them, commoners, nobles, warriors, healers, blind citizens, disabled people who'd never been allowed inside spaces of power before. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not separated by rank, but gathered as one collective consciousness, one kingdom recognizing itself as unified for perhaps the first time in its history. The Conservative Council elders had convened in a final meeting hours earlier, and even their last attempt at resistance had crumbled like sand beneath waves. If we allow this wedding, we're admitting the hierarchy is finished, Asher had said, his ancient voice trembling with fury. It's finished whether we admit it or not, Theron had replied. and there was something almost like relief in his voice. The relief of a man finally allowed to set down a burden he'd carried too long. The question is whether we guide the change or fight against it. Either way, the Omega becomes queen. Either way, the kingdom transforms. Aldous had said nothing. He'd simply accepted what every power broker eventually accepts. That resistance becomes irrelevant when the thing being resisted has already become inevitable. In her preparation chambers, Nova stood before a mirror and truly saw herself for the first time since publicly acknowledging her sight. The wedding gown was perfection itself. It flowed like water, cascading from her shoulders in layers that seemed to contain the entire depth of the night sky. Pearls had been embedded into the fabric, and they caught the candlelight, creating the impression that she was somehow lit from within. Her hair was woven with silver threads that caught the glow, and when she moved, the entire dress seemed to move with intention, as if it understood the magnitude of this moment. But it was the blindfold that drew the eye. Pure white silk, pristine and deliberate, wrapped carefully around her head, not hiding her sight, but proclaiming her choice. The blindfold was a statement written in fabric. I am choosing this. I am choosing how I will be perceived. Are you nervous? Alara asked, and her voice carried the particular tenderness of a woman who'd watched another woman transform herself through sheer will. Terrified, Nova admitted, and there was no shame in the admission. Not of the wedding, of what comes after. The kingdom isn't ready to see what I truly am. Maybe they need to be shocked into readiness, Alara suggested, and Nova heard the smile in her voice. Nova turned to face her second-in-command, the woman who'd become more sister than advisor over the years. Yes, perhaps they do. The ceremony was set to begin at noon, when the sun was directly overhead, casting no shadows. A deliberate choice. In harsh light, there was nowhere for pretense to hide. The cathedral doors were massive, carved with ancient symbols that had been carefully repaired and reinterpreted to reflect the new order. They swung open slowly, and the assembled crowd rose to their feet instinctively, drawn upward by something neither sight nor sound could fully explain. Music began, not the traditional wedding march with its militaristic cadence, but something entirely new. The composition seemed to exist between worlds, partly ceremony, partly spiritual invocation, partly the sound of a heart beating beneath everything. It wasn't composed by any single person, Nova later learned. Instead, it had been created collaboratively by musicians from every caste, every tradition, every perspective. The harmony that emerged was unlike anything the kingdom had ever heard. And then Nova appeared. The crowd gasped an audible, collective intake of breath that rippled through the cathedral like wind across water. She emerged wearing the blindfold, and the shock of that simple piece of white silk was seismic. Whispers erupted, spreading like wildfire through the assembled thousands. She's actually blind, someone said, and there was something almost like relief in the voice. Relief that the world made sense again, that this Omega, despite everything, still carried limitation. She's showing them, another voice said, and that voice belonged to a young Omega whose understanding of what was actually happening superseded the older generation's confusion. Nova walked, and every step was perfect. She didn't hesitate. She didn't stumble. She didn't use her hands to feel her way. She moved through the cathedral with the supernatural precision of someone who'd navigated this space 1,000 times, who understood its dimensions and acoustics, and the particular way light moved through its stained glass windows. The blindfold didn't diminish her, it elevated her into something almost mythical. Behind her, thousands of people stood without even realizing they were standing. The physical reality of what they were witnessing couldn't be ignored. A blind woman walking alone through the largest, most complex space in the kingdom, without guidance, without hesitation, without a single moment of uncertainty. By the time she reached the altar, nearly the entire cathedral was standing a silent testament to the transformation happening before their eyes. Only the conservative elders remained seated. The confrontation came from the shadows where it had always lived. Council Elder Asher rose ancient, rigid, representing the old order in its purest, most crystallized form. She can see. His voice carried the particular outrage of someone watching their entire worldview dissolve in real time. This is a deception. This entire... Nova raised her hand. and the gesture alone silenced him more effectively than any words could have. "I can see," she said, and her voice carried through the entire cathedral with the weight of centuries. "I have been able to see for 10 years. I chose not to use that sight to navigate the world that rejected me. Instead, I used my other senses to understand truth. And what I learned is this: sight without wisdom is blindness. Power without compassion is tyranny." She turned to face the kingdom, not just Asher, not just the conservative elders, but every person present. And in that moment, with absolute deliberation and intention, Nova reached up and removed the blindfold. Her eyes opened. They were luminous, not with any artificial light, but with the inner radiance of something ancient awakening. They glowed faintly, reflecting centuries of accumulated power and understanding, and within them was the particular clarity that could only come from truly seeing everything, both what was present and what could be, both the hierarchy that had tried to crush her and the possibility of something infinitely better. The cathedral erupted. Not all of it, the conservative contingent sat frozen in shock, but the majority of the assembled kingdom seemed to collectively exhale. Omega stood and wept. Betas cheered. Young people shouted with joy, and through it all, Nova stood at the altar with her eyes open, refusing to diminish herself for anyone's comfort. "The hierarchy you're defending is already dead," she said to Asher, and her voice was gentle despite the absolute certainty it carried. "I'm simply showing the kingdom the corpse." The ceremony itself was unlike anything traditional. The priest, an elderly man named Fenner, who'd served the kingdom for 40 years, was visibly disoriented but doing his best to adapt. He began the traditional words, but Dante interrupted gently, asking permission to speak his own vows. It was a question that had never been asked before. A king requesting permission instead of demanding it. And the priest, understanding the magnitude of what was happening, simply nodded. Dante turned to face Nova, fully not just facing her body, but meeting her newly revealed eyes with the kind of vulnerability that few alpha males ever permitted themselves to feel. "I stood in a garden 15 years ago," he began, and his voice carried the weight of genuine remorse. "And I chose wrong. I chose power over you. I chose hierarchy over truth. I chose the world, as it was taught to me, over the world, as I could have built it with you." He paused, gathering himself. "Today, I'm choosing again. But this time, I choose you not because you need saving, but because I need you to help me see. I promise to listen when you challenge me. I promise to never again choose comfort over justice. And I promise to love you fiercely, not as a possession, but as an equal." He removed a ring from his hand, silver and gold woven together in a pattern that echoed the mate mark on Nova's collarbone, and slid it onto her finger with ceremony and reverence. Then Nova spoke, and when she did, her voice carried the weight of every year she'd been underestimated, every moment she'd been deemed insufficient, every instance she'd chosen to believe in her own power anyway. "I loved you when it was easier to hate you," she said. "I built a sanctuary to prove I didn't need you. I made myself powerful to show you that worth isn't measured by hierarchy. But these were lies I told myself to survive the wound of your rejection." Her eyes, now revealed, now glowing, met his completely. "I needed you to become someone worthy of my love, and you did. You're still doing it. I promise to challenge you when comfort tempts you. I promise to remind you, always, what justice costs. And I promise to love you not as a king, but as a man who learned to see." She placed a matching ring on his hand, silver and gold, woven together, a perfect pair. And as their hands touched, something extraordinary happened. Gold and silver threads of light spiraled around them, both visible to every person in the cathedral, undeniable, impossible to explain through any conventional means. The mate bond, dormant for so long, suddenly blazed into life. It wasn't just magical, it was spiritual, ancient, a connection that transcended flesh and blood and circumstance. The light spread outward from them, touching everyone present. For a moment, every person in that cathedral experienced what Nova experienced, the knowledge that they were witnessing something sacred, that they were present at the moment when love, authentic and complete, rewrote the laws of a kingdom. "By the old laws and the new wisdom," the priest said, his voice trembling with something that approached reverence. I declare you bonded. Husband and wife, queen and king, equal and eternal. Dante and Nova kissed and the cathedral erupted. The reception hall was transformed into something that resembled celebration but felt more like spiritual revolution. Music played the same collaborative composition that had accompanied Nova's walk, now remixed into something celebratory, and people danced together without regard for caste or station. An Omega danced with an Alpha. A blind warrior danced with a sighted healer. A Beta administrator danced with a young commoner who'd worked in the fields. The hierarchy had been so thoroughly shattered that people didn't even know how to segregate themselves anymore. Nova and Dante danced together, and their movement was synchronized in a way that transcended mere physical coordination. They moved as one consciousness inhabiting two forms, what thousands of years of mate magic could accomplish when both partners were finally willing to surrender completely to it. "We did it," Nova whispered as they moved through the steps. "We actually transformed the kingdom." Dante's response came with genuine humility. "No, you transformed it. I just finally caught up. We transformed it together," Nova corrected. "That's the whole point of everything we've built. That's the foundation of the new order." The kingdom's transformation wasn't immediate. Change never is. But over the following years, the reality of what Nova and Dante had begun became undeniable. Laws were written that gave Omegas legal standing equal to Alphas and Betas. Blind citizens were integrated into every profession based on ability rather than assumption. Disabled people, once deemed unfit, were recognized as possessing unique gifts that enhanced their communities. The economic systems shifted to prioritize justice over exploitation. The educational structures transformed to teach children that hierarchy was a human construct, not a natural law. And more than that, the psychological shift happened. Children began growing up in a world where an Omega could be queen, where blindness could be a teacher rather than a tragedy, where power was measured by what you could build rather than what you could dominate. The Northern Rebellion, which had seemed so threatening, crumbled without even serious conflict. When the Northern Lords realized that the king had genuinely dismantled hierarchy rather than simply redistributing it, that their rebellion couldn't restore what no longer existed, they simply accepted it. Some slowly embraced the new order. Some retreated to their territories and governed traditionally. But none could destroy what Nova and Dante had built, because they'd built it not on force, but on truth. Other kingdoms began to watch. Ambassadors came to Silver Spire to study the transformation. Young leaders from neighboring realms came to learn from Dante and Nova, and slowly, carefully, the seeds of change began to spread beyond the kingdom's borders. 5 years after the wedding, the children came. Twins born to Nova and Dante, Lyria and Astor, manifested power that astonished even their parents. Lyria carried her mother's luminous eyes and her father's commanding presence. Esther possessed his father's strength and his mother's supernatural perception. But what truly distinguished them was their understanding of themselves. They grew up in a kingdom without hierarchy. They never learned to see one caste as superior to another. They played with other children, both blind and sighted, both Omega and Alpha and Beta, without any awareness that such distinctions were supposed to matter. When adults tried to teach them traditional hierarchy, they seemed genuinely confused. Why would one way of being be better than another? Became their refrain. Ronan, Dante's eldest son, had grown into a warrior and teacher. He taught mixed-caste combat training to young people, and when asked about hierarchy, he simply replied, "Strength isn't about dominance. It's about using your power to protect those who need protection. That's what my father learned. That's what Queen Nova taught us all." And through it all, Nova continued her work. She traveled the kingdom, establishing healing sanctuaries, training new Omega healers, teaching people both blind and sighted that limitations were often doorways to undiscovered power. She became known throughout the realms as the blind queen who taught a kingdom to truly see, but she never accepted that title as complete. "I didn't teach anyone to see," she'd say. "I simply refused to accept their blindness as my limitation, and eventually, they stopped accepting it either." Dante transformed from a king who wielded dominance into a leader who wielded wisdom. He became known as the Alpha who chose to surrender, and that surrender, rather than diminishing him, elevated him into a kind of power that transcended traditional authority. Young leaders from other kingdoms came to study with him, and he taught them through questions rather than commands, helping them find their own transformation rather than imposing his. One evening, years into their transformation, Nova and Dante stood on the same balcony where they'd first privately acknowledged their love after the assassination attempt. The kingdom stretched below them, thriving, prosperous, imperfect but genuinely just. Lights glowed from windows throughout the capital, markets remained open late, laughter drifted upward from streets where people of all castes gathered without segregation or subordination. "Do you ever regret it?" Dante asked. "The pain, the rejection, the years of building in the shadows?" Nova considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No, because every scar I carry reminds me that transformation is possible, that the world we're born into isn't the world we have to accept." Dante took her hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "I've been thinking about that moment in the garden 15 years ago, when I chose the throne over you. Have you regretted it?" Nova asked. "Every day for 15 years, Dante said. "And then, not. Because if I hadn't made that choice, we wouldn't have become who we needed to become. You wouldn't have built your sanctuary. You wouldn't have learned your power. I wouldn't have faced the consequences of my hierarchy, and finally understood that true strength is giving power away, not holding it tightly. So it was necessary? The pain?" Nova pressed. "I think so," Dante replied. "I think we needed to be broken separately before we could be whole together. And I think the kingdom needed to see that transformation, to understand that change isn't weakness, it's courage." Nova squeezed his hand, and they stood together in silence, watching the kingdom they'd remade continue to evolve, continue to transform, continue to become something better than what it had been. Years pass. The kingdom that once seemed immobile transforms into a living example of what's possible when hierarchy dissolves. But Nova and Dante understand something fundamental. Transformation isn't a destination. It's a continuous journey. And the greatest gift they can give the world isn't their perfect love story. It's the proof that change is possible, that every person told they're not enough has within them the power to build a new world, and that the blindest kingdom can learn to truly see. Chapter 10. The New Order, Legacy and Transformation. The sanctuary that Nova established on the outskirts of the capital had grown into something beyond what she'd ever imagined it could become. What had started as a refuge for rejected Omegas had transformed into an academy, a place where young healers of all castes came to learn not just the mechanics of healing, but the philosophy behind it. The sanctuary's gardens overflowed with medicinal plants cultivated by blind gardeners who navigated through scent and touch rather than sight. The healing chambers had been redesigned to accommodate every body, every disability, every perceived limitation transformed into a unique strength. Nova moved through these spaces with the authority of someone who'd spent decades perfecting her craft, and yet with the humility of someone who understood that she was always still learning, still discovering new ways that power could manifest. "Healing isn't about fixing what's broken," she told the assembled group of young Omega healers gathered in her sanctuary. "It's about helping people discover the strength they already have. It's about believing in people's value when they've been taught they have none." A young blind healer, maybe 20 years old, raised her hand. "Queen Nova, do you think we'll ever reach a point where blindness isn't seen as a limitation at all?" Nova considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness. "I think we'll reach a point where blindness is understood as a different way of perceiving rather than a failure to perceive. And more importantly, I think we'll reach a point where it doesn't matter, where people stop categorizing ability and limitation and simply see each person as containing multitudes." The girl nodded, absorbing the philosophy that would shape her entire approach to healing. In the capital, the council chamber had transformed into something unrecognizable from its former iteration. The rigid hierarchy of elevated thrones had been replaced with a circular configuration where every council member, regardless of caste, sat at equal height. The conversations that happened in this chamber now were fundamentally different from the ones that had occurred in the old order. The northern territories are still resistant to the new structure. A beta administrator explained to the assembled council. "They're not openly defying the new laws, but they're not embracing them either. How do we encourage adoption without forcing it?" Nova, present as an equal voice rather than as queen above the council, considered the question. "You don't force it. You show them the benefits. You let the next generation be raised differently, and they'll naturally embrace it. Force was the old way. Transformation requires trust. Dante's still technically king, but fundamentally transformed in how he wielded that authority, added his voice. Nova's right. We show, don't tell. We lead by example rather than by command, and we accept that some territories might take longer than others. Transformation isn't a single moment. It's a continuous journey. The conversation continued, and what struck anyone observing was that it wasn't performative. There was genuine debate. People challenged each other, and the disagreement never descended into hierarchy or dominance. It remained, instead, a conversation between equals trying to find the best path forward. The market of Silverspire had become a destination for traders from a dozen different kingdoms. What had once been a rigid structure where merchants were segregated by caste now resembled something closer to a festival of commerce and culture. Omega healers sold remedies alongside alpha warriors selling weaponry. Blind craftspeople crafted intricate goods that were considered the finest in all the realms. Children of mixed castes worked alongside their parents, learning trades and skills without ever being taught that some work was superior to others. An elderly merchant who'd lived through both orders remarked to a younger trader, "The irony is delicious. By dismantling hierarchy and embracing justice, we became more prosperous, more influential, more powerful than we ever were under the old system. The kingdom's strength increased precisely because we stopped measuring strength through dominance." In the royal chambers, Nova and Dante existed in a partnership that transcended the traditional definition of marriage. They shared a bed, yes. They shared authority, yes. But more than that, they'd learned to share a consciousness to understand each other with the kind of depth that only comes from having been broken together and then rebuilt in full awareness of exactly what each other was capable of. One evening, Dante broached a question that had been haunting him for years. "Nova, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. If I told you tomorrow that I wanted to surrender the crown, that I wanted to step away from politics and power and simply live, would you stay with me?" Nova's response was immediate. "Yes, but I'd ask you to be completely certain before you made that choice. Leadership isn't about power, but stepping away might create a void that someone less just would fill." "That's not what I'm asking," Dante said. "I'm asking if you'd stay with me, if I chose differently, if I became someone other than who I am now." Nova considered the question fully before responding. "Yes, I'd stay. Not because I'm bound to you, I'm not, but because I choose you. And that choice would remain, even if circumstances changed." The admission hung between them, a renewal of their commitment that required no ceremony, no binding magic, no external validation. Just two people choosing each other, continuously, consciously, completely. Ronan, now approaching his 20th year, had taken his place as a leader in his own right. He didn't claim the position based on his bloodline. Indeed, the kingdom had shifted away from inheritance as a pathway to power. Instead, he'd earned his place through demonstrated competence and genuine commitment to the principles his parents had established. The training academy he directed had become legendary. Young warriors from across the kingdom, and increasingly from other kingdoms, came to learn from him not the traditional alpha combat techniques of domination and hierarchy, but a new warrior philosophy that emphasized protection over conquest, community defense over individual glory. A visiting warrior from a neighboring kingdom watched Ronan train a mixed group of young combatants. "In my homeland," the visitor said, "Omegas are trained only in defensive positions. How do you teach them offensive strategy?" "They learn the same strategies as everyone else," Ronan replied, genuinely confused by the question. "Omega biology doesn't determine capability, it determines difference. And difference is strength, not weakness." The visitor left that exchange with something fundamentally shifted in his understanding of what was possible. Years continued to pass, and transformation continued to spread like light through darkness. Other kingdoms began implementing aspects of Silverspire's new order. The changes were slow, sometimes met with resistance, occasionally failing entirely and requiring new approaches. But the fundamental shift had begun. The hierarchical system that had dominated the realms for millennia began to crack, and through the cracks came the possibility of something different. Nova's story became legendary, not as a fairy tale of a blind girl who caught a king, but as a testament to the power of transformation. Young people who'd been told they were worthless found hope in her example. People who'd been told their limitations defined them found liberation in her teaching. And people who'd been told the world couldn't change found proof that it could. Dante's transformation became equally legendary. The story of an alpha who learned to surrender, a king who voluntarily diminished his own power, a man who had the courage to admit he'd been fundamentally wrong about almost everything. Together, they became not just rulers of Silverspire, but symbols of what was possible when people were willing to do the internal work of transformation. In her healing sanctuary, years later, an elderly Nova trained the next generation of healers. Her eyes had lost none of their luminescence. If anything, they glowed more brightly as she aged, as if the accumulated wisdom of her years was being crystallized into that inner light. "Tell me," she asked a group of young healers, "what is the connection between blindness and sight?" The young people offered various answers. One said they were opposites. Another said they were just different ways of perceiving. A third suggested they were both valid methods of understanding the world. Nova smiled. "They're all true, and none of them are complete. The real connection is this. Blindness taught me to see, not with my eyes, but with my soul. It taught me that the systems I'd inherited weren't inevitable, they were choices. And if they were choices, I could choose something different." She paused, letting the wisdom settle. "The greatest gift blindness gave me wasn't supernatural perception or magical healing. It was the absolute certainty that worth has nothing to do with how the world perceives you. That power is internal, not external. That transformation is always possible for those brave enough to choose it." One final evening, as the sun set over a kingdom that had been fundamentally transformed, Nova and Dante stood together where they'd stood so many times before on the castle balcony, overlooking the realm they'd remade. They were older now. Nova's hair had silvered, though her eyes remained luminous. Dante bore the particular dignity of a man who'd lived through massive internal transformation. And between them existed something that transcended romance, transcended passion, transcended even the mate bond that had originally pulled them together. It was recognition. Complete, absolute, mutual recognition of who the other was, who they'd become, what they'd built together. "I want to tell you something," Nova said, and her voice carried the weight of everything she'd learned, everything she'd become. "The story people tell about us isn't the real story. The real story isn't about blindness and sight. It's about every person who's been told they're not enough, and the moment they decide to believe in themselves anyway." Dante listened, as he always did, understanding that Nova's wisdom was something precious and rare. "When the world tells you you're worthless," Nova continued, "there are two choices: believe them or build something that proves them wrong. I chose the second. And in choosing, I learned that blindness wasn't my weakness. It was my teacher. The hierarchy didn't diminish me, it refined me. Love didn't weaken me, it transformed me." She turned to look directly at him, and her glowing eyes held centuries of accumulated truth. "This is the story of one blind woman and one alpha king who learned to see," she said. "But it's also your story, because inside every hierarchy is someone being told they're not enough, and inside every person told they're not enough is the power to prove the lie. The only question is, what will you choose?" The kingdom spread before them, continued to transform, continued to evolve, continued to become something better. And in that transformation was proof that change was possible, that power could be dismantled, that love, true, transformative, revolutionary love, could remake entire worlds. The blind woman who'd learned to see had taught a kingdom to truly perceive. And in teaching that kingdom, she'd helped countless others understand something fundamental, that the real power was never about dominance. It was about choosing, continuously and consciously, to see each other, truly see each other, and to build something that honored that recognition. Thank you for spending hours in this world with me, for witnessing a love story that challenges everything you thought you knew about power, sight, and worth, for believing, even for just a moment, that transformation is possible not just for characters in a story, but for you, for me, for our world. Like this video if Nova's story reminded you that strength wears many faces, that blindness isn't weakness, and that love requires complete vulnerability. Like if Dante's transformation gave you hope that people can truly change, that admitting you were wrong is the beginning of wisdom. Subscribe to Celine's romance collection for more soul-shifting, paradigm-breaking werewolf romance that will haunt your dreams and challenge your beliefs about power, love, and what it means to be truly seen. Comment below and tell me, what was your favorite moment from the entire story? Which character did you relate to most, Nova, Dante, or Isolde? What hierarchy in your life do you need to challenge? Would you watch a sequel or spin-off about this universe? Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their blindness might actually be their greatest gift, that their perceived weakness might be their actual power, that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to choose it. This has been Celine's Romance Collection, where broken souls learn to heal, where the meek inherit kingdoms, where love transforms not just two hearts, but entire worlds, where hierarchy dissolves not through violence, but through the courage of one person choosing to be truly seen, where love rewrites the laws of power, where every Omega becomes a queen, where blindness teaches how to truly see, where transformation begins with one choice. Every revolution starts with one person choosing to see. Nova, the blind queen.